Welcome back, friends. Tonight, we're journeying to ancient Sparta time when discipline ruled every breath and childhood was shaped by the call to war. But before we settle in, a small favor. If you enjoy these calming dives into history, please consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps our little channel grow and keeps the stories flowing. And I'd love to know where in the world are you drifting off from tonight. Drop a comment below and let's keep building this quiet global community. Now, take a deep breath, let the tension melt away, dim the lights, and let your body soften as we slip into the stillness of the past and explore the silent, sacred halls of the Spartan agoge. The sun had not yet climbed over the jagged hills of Laconia, but the air already stirred with purpose. In a quiet barracks outside the city walls of Sparta, boys no older than 7 were stirring to life, not by choice, but by tradition. This was not a home. This was the agoge, Sparta's legendary system of military education, designed not merely to instruct, but to transform. The boys slept not on beds of straw or comfort, but on bundles of reeds they had been ordered to gather themselves. The cold stone beneath offered no softness, no relief, only a constant reminder that weakness had no place in this world. Each boy here had been taken from his family, as was custom in Sparta. At the age of 7, a Spartan male child was considered no longer his mother's son, but the property of the state. The transition was abrupt, wrenching, and absolute. He had arrived only days ago, carrying little more than a woolen cloak and the echoes of his mother's final embrace. Now, stripped of affection, he was a trainee among dozens of other boys, all equal in the eyes of Sparta, yet constantly ranked by merit, strength, and obedience. The room was dim and silent. The only light filtered through narrow slits in the stone walls, casting faint golden bars across the dust-swirled floor. A senior youth, perhaps 13, paced between the rows of resting bodies, wooden staff in hand, watching for the first signs of movement. Silence was the rule. But it was more than just a preference for discipline. It was a law of identity. To speak freely was to betray weakness. In Sparta, a boy's worth was measured not only in how he fought, but in how little he complained, how still he could sit, how well he could endure without words. Soon, the call to rise came not as a shout, but as a sharp clack of the staff on stone. The boys stood swiftly. Delay meant punishment. There was no gentle easing into the day. They moved as one, faces blank, eyes alert. The cold morning bit at their skin, for they wore little more than tunics. No shoes, no extra layers. These were not privileges afforded to warriors in training. The cold was not their enemy, but their instructor. Their first task was not training, but inspection. Each boy stood straight, while another, slightly older trainee, looked him over for signs of dirt, disorder, or sloppiness. Hair unkempt, cloak askew, eyes puffy from sleep. All of these were grounds for discipline. And if punishment was due, it was swift. A cuff to the ear, a stinging blow with a switch, or the loss of one's scant breakfast. These small indignities were not considered cruelty. They were, in fact, a kindness, a lesson, a gift of pain to shape the soul. Breakfast, such as it was, came in the form of a meager bowl of black broth, made from pig's blood, vinegar, and herbs. It was known less for nourishment and more for necessity. Beside it, a crust of barley bread. There were no second helpings, no lingering at the mess. Eating was done quickly, in silence. The boys sat cross-legged on the hard floor, their backs straight and their eyes forward. A spilled drop an audible slurp, even a glance out of place could result in punishment or withheld rations the next day. And yet, beneath this harsh regimen, something remarkable stirred. Discipline forged more than muscle, it sharpened the mind and welded boys together into a strange brotherhood of survival. Their eyes, hollow at first, began to share silent looks of mutual endurance. They learned, without words, to signal each other, to help hide a bruised rib or offer an extra scrap of bread to the smallest among them. Compassion was not taught. It was smuggled between rules, learned in whispers and glances, an act of rebellion as much as solidarity. After the morning meal came drills. The boys were marched to the yard, barefoot, always, and divided into groups. Older trainees led the exercises, themselves only a few years older than the recruits. There were no adult instructors, not at this early hour. Sparta believed the youth should police the youth, that obedience meant more when enforced by one's peers. They ran laps in the dust, climbed rope walls, threw spears, and wrestled in tightly matched pairs. There was no reward for victory, only shame in defeat. Every stumble was noticed, every hesitation marked. Blood was common, teeth were often lost, and tears unacceptable. Crying earned scorn and ridicule from both trainers and fellow boys. Those who broke down too often were quietly marked as unworthy. The city would not invest in the weak, and so pain became familiar. Boys learned to fall without sound, to bite the inside of their cheeks, to hold in gasps. They did not train for hours. They trained until someone collapsed, and then they trained more. This was the agoge, relentless, unyielding, designed to create not just warriors, but instruments of war. But not all learning was of the body. Between drills, the boys were made to recite poetry, particularly the works of Tertirza, Spartan poet, whose verses glorified death in battle and the virtues of endurance. The words were burned into their minds as surely as any scar. They practiced brevity in speech, cultivating the infamous Spartan wit that could gut a man with a single word. Silence was golden, but when one spoke, it had to matter. Lunch was no more generous than breakfast. Often it was the same broth, reheated. Occasionally, a sliver of cheese or dried fruit would appear, a gift from the city, or, more likely, bait to catch thieves. Because theft was not merely allowed, it was encouraged. Boys were expected to steal food when hungry, but if they were caught, the punishment was severe. Not for stealing, but for failing. Failure in any form was intolerable. In the quieter hours of the afternoon, tasks shifted. Some boys were sent to gather reeds or clean the barracks. Others were set to crafting, mending cloaks, sharpening wooden practice weapons, or repairing sandals. Still others were chosen for lessons in survival, how to build a shelter, start a fire, or move silently in the dark. These were not skills for comfort, but for war. Every moment of instruction had a purpose. Every act was bent toward one end, to prepare the boy not just to fight, but to live as if fighting were the only life. As the sun dipped low, casting golden shadows across the hills, the boys returned to the barracks. There was no singing, no idle laughter. The Spartan boy was not encouraged to delight in frivolity. But as they lay again on their reed mats, the air heavy with the scent of sweat and dust, some small peace settled over them. They had survived another day. No one had broken. No one had failed badly enough to be cast out. And in Sparta, that was enough. The silence before sleep was profound. Only the crackle of distant hearths in the city beyond or the low hoot of an owl in the hills disturbed the stillness. The boys lay with hands folded on their chests, eyes fixed on the dark rafters above each, thinking, perhaps, of home. But the agoge allowed little sentiment. Tomorrow would come soon, and with it, more tests. In time, even the memories of home would fade. The barracks would become all they knew, not because they were imprisoned, but because they were being transformed layer by layer, ache by ache, into sons, not of women, but of Sparta. And so we drift now, dear listener, through this world of flint and silence, a world where a boy's heartbeat quickened not at lullabies, but at the sound of the spear. Let the stillness of the agoge cradle you tonight. Let its hard rhythms soothe you into sleep. And remember, even the harshest systems are made of children dreaming in the dark. The moment a Spartan boy was taken from his family at age 7 marked a fundamental rupture, not just in household dynamics, but in identity itself. For centuries, this transition had been a rite of passage, considered essential to crafting the warrior citizens Sparta so desperately relied upon. And yet, behind the ritualized stoicism of this tradition, there remained a poignant and deeply human sorrow, one that was rarely spoken of, but always felt. Mothers wept quietly, often out of view, and fathers turned their backs quickly, for too much sentiment might shame the child and weaken his resolve. The departure itself was not ceremonious. There were no songs, no tokens of remembrance, no parting gifts. The boy was expected to walk to the barracks under escort, his head held high. Any display of emotion was frowned upon. Spartan culture trained parents just as rigorously as it trained children to be unyielding, detached, and above all, obedient to the needs of the state. A child did not belong to a family, he belonged to Sparta. And when the time came, he was handed over, not with affection, but with solemn pride. For the boy, the emotions were tangled and confusing. He was still young enough to crave his mother's voice and the comfort of her touch, yet already old enough to know that seeking such comfort would be seen as shameful. Many boys cried silently their first night in the barracks, their faces buried in scratchy cloaks, careful not to be heard. There were no arms to hold them, no one to whisper reassurance. Instead, there was cold stone and the knowledge that softness would only delay the hardening expected of them. Fathers often offered parting words, not of love, but of duty. "Come back with your shield, or on it," they might say. These were not idle phrases, but creeds handed down through generations. To die in battle was honorable, to flee was disgraceful. And so, even in farewell, a father's role was to begin the boy's indoctrination, to remind him that Sparta's glory was more important than any individual's comfort or safety. The state prepared the family for this separation from the moment the child was born. Spartan infants were inspected for physical perfection. Those deemed weak or malformed were abandoned. This was not considered cruelty, but practicality. Only the strong were fit to serve. Mothers were taught that raising a son meant raising a soldier. Affection was allowed, but only so long as it did not interfere with a child's path toward duty. Fathers, especially those who had served in war, spoke sparingly, their approval hard to earn. Praise was measured and discipline constant. By the time a boy left for the agoge, he had likely already spent his short life being tested. He would have been trained to endure discomfort given less food, expected to bathe in cold water, and instructed to speak little and listen well. Games at home often mimicked war, and stories were filled not with heroes who loved, but with heroes who fought and died bravely. There was little illusion left by the time he entered the barracks. What came next was not a surprise, but a deepening of a lesson already learned. Life was not for pleasure, but for service. Some mothers, known for their own strength and resolve, took pride in their son's departure. A Spartan woman was expected to be strong of spirit, to support her son's sacrifice with unwavering resolve. It was said that Spartan mothers did not wail at funerals or plead for their sons to return. Instead, they held their heads high, believing that to die nobly was better than to live in shame. They were not passive figures. They were the first forge upon which a Spartan's character was hammered. Still, even the most disciplined mother likely held on a moment longer when her son's hand slipped from hers. Even the most stoic father might pause to watch the small figure retreat into the shadow of the barracks. These were human hearts, even if they had been trained to beat in rhythm with the city's demands. Love did not disappear, was simply buried beneath layers of expectation, like embers hidden beneath ash. The cost of Spartan greatness was often borne in silence. For the child, the adjustment was swift and brutal. The first week in the barracks stripped away any illusions of comfort. He was no longer anyone's son. He was one of many a number, a body, a future shield-bearer. The older boys wasted no time asserting dominance. They taught through blows, through cold indifference, through the withholding of kindness. Some newcomers crumbled, others adapted quickly, burying their fear and mirroring the hardness around them. These were the ones who would survive. And yet, deep within even the most obedient recruit, a part of the boy still clung to memory. A scent, a lullaby, the image of a mother's smile. They were not erased, but folded quietly into the soul, never to be spoken of again. These fragile remnants of home became private talismans, invisible yet powerful. They would surface years later, in battle, in the quiet before dawn, or perhaps never at all. For in Sparta, sentiment was a secret one, learned to keep even from oneself. The Spartan barracks, though simple in design, were a monument to discipline, built not for comfort but for control. They stood in a cluster on the edge of the city, close enough to be supervised by elders, yet distant enough to feel like a world apart. Each structure was fashioned from thick stone, with narrow slits in the walls for ventilation and light. No ornamentation decorated the exteriors. To a passing eye, they might resemble prisons more than schools. But to the Spartans, these were sanctuaries of transformation, the womb from which future warriors would emerge. Inside, the barracks were cold and bare. Floors were stone or packed earth. The ceilings, high and dark, were designed to trap the heat of summer and preserve the chill of winter. There were no private quarters, no personal rooms. Boys slept together in long rows, their mats of woven reeds laid out with military precision. The only possessions allowed were a single cloak and perhaps a carved wooden spoon. Any sign of luxury, a hidden trinket, an extra scrap of cloth was confiscated and its owner punished. Spartan ideology demanded that boys learn to live with less than they needed, not more. Each dormitory held roughly 20 to 30 boys, all around the same age. Grouped by cohort, the eldest among them acted as monitors, enforcing discipline with both authority and, at times, cruelty. These youths were not chosen for their compassion, but for their adherence to rules. They reported daily to instructors known as paid nomoi, older men appointed by the city to oversee the moral and physical training of the boys. These instructors visited often, but rarely interfered. The system was largely self-governing. Boys policed boys, forming a strict and unyielding chain of command. Beyond the dormitories lay the training yards. These open-air spaces, surrounded by stone walls, were the heart of daily life in the agoge. Here, barefoot boys ran drills, practiced combat techniques, and endured grueling physical trials. The yard was always active, no matter the weather, rain or shine, heat or frost. Training never ceased. The only variable was the intensity. The ground was packed with years of footfall, stained in places with blood, and littered with makeshift obstacles used to test agility, strength, and coordination. Near the yard sat the mess hall, a rectangular space with long, low tables and no chairs. Spartan boys sat on the floor, legs crossed, backs straight. Meals were sparse and served without ceremony. Each cohort cooked and ate together under the watchful eye of a senior youth. Meals were a test of discipline and hierarchy as much as sustenance. Boys took turns preparing the food, usually a black broth of blood and vinegar, barley, or pulses. There were no individual portions. The group ate from shared bowls, learning to divide fairly and quietly. Any sign of gluttony or complaint resulted in punishment or exclusion from the next meal. Scattered around the barracks complex were smaller rooms used for instruction, though not in the academic sense. Spartans placed little value on formal education beyond what was needed for war. Still, boys were taught basic literacy, enough to read commands, memorize poetry, and study laws. More importantly, these rooms were where they learned obedience, silence, and loyalty. Instructors would pose moral riddles, test their capacity for debate in a single sentence, or challenge them to deliver clever responses under pressure. The lessons were brief but sharp, razor-edged, like the city's ideals. There was also a small chamber used for punishments. Not every infraction warranted public correction. Some offenses, especially acts of cowardice, dishonesty, or softness, were dealt with in private. The room was bare but ominous. A leather strap, a rod, a switch. Spartan punishment was swift and often symbolic. The boy who betrayed the group's code would be punished before them, reminded not only of his own failure, but of what Sparta would not tolerate. These punishments were not random. They were calculated, administered with the intent to shape, never to destroy. The walls of the barracks were covered with etchings, not of art, but of rules, mottos, and names. Past graduates carved their marks into the stone, short, pithy statements of resolve or victory. Obey or bleed, one read. Speak only when worthy, said another. These phrases served as constant reminders of the expectations placed upon each boy. They did not serve to inspire comfort or joy, but to reinforce the ever-present gaze of the state. Even in sleep, even in silence, Sparta was watching. Despite the uniformity, small differences emerged over time. One dormitory might boast the fastest runners, another the best wrestlers. Rivalries grew, and with them a sense of identity that extended beyond the self. A boy did not live as an individual. He lived as part of his cohort, his group, his brotherhood. Every achievement was shared, every mistake a collective shame. This interdependence was not accidentally, was the seed of phalanx warfare, where each hoplite would one day depend on the shield of the man beside him. As night fell over the barracks, darkness settled without ceremony. There were no lamps, no firelight to read by. The boys retired to their mats, wrapping their cloaks tightly, their bodies sore and their minds buzzing with exhaustion. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional cough or shifting body. And in that stillness, surrounded by stone and shadow, the barracks breathed. It was more than a building. It was a crucible, a place that stripped away everything unworthy and left behind only what could endure. Morning in the Spartan barracks began not with the warmth of sunlight or the easing comfort of a familiar voice, but with a jolt into discipline. Long before dawn cast its first soft light on the jagged mountains of Laconia, the barracks were already stirring to life. No rooster crowed, no bell rang. Instead, a sharp rap of a staff against the cold stone floor announced the start of another unyielding day. The boys, conditioned by repetition and fear of punishment, sat upright at once. They were not permitted to stretch or yawn. The first action of the day was attention and readiness, performed in silence. The early morning air was frigid, especially during the long Spartan winters. But the boys were not allowed additional coverings. Their cloaks, worn year-round, were thin and rough, meant more for durability than warmth. Feet bare, limbs stiff with the night's chill, they folded their reed mats quickly and stood in formation. This first assembly of the day was not just for roll call. It was an inspection, a moment to scrutinize every boy for signs of laziness or carelessness. A tunic askew, an unwashed face, or a sluggish response to orders was met with swift disciplines, sometimes a verbal lashing, other times a blow from a stick. Physical training began immediately before the day's first meal. The boys were marched out into the open yard, where they ran laps barefoot across the coarse earth, dodging stones and avoiding each other with practiced agility. Their bodies, already lean from meager rations, were hardened by constant movement. The drills were designed to awaken the limbs, build stamina, and reinforce the idea that pain was the proper companion of growth. There were no warm-ups, no breaks. Running was followed by squats, leaping exercises, and agility routines. Instructors barked commands, not cruelly, but without compassion. Efficiency, not encouragement, was the norm. After this first burst of exertion, the boys moved into combat drills. They practiced wrestling in pairs, locked in fierce but silent struggles on the dirt floor. Each match was observed and scored by older youths who recorded not just wins and losses, but demeanor. Was the boy hesitant? Did he grunt or flinch? Did he maintain composure in the face of defeat? Training was not solely about strength. It was about presence, poise, and the ability to endure without question. A boy who cried out from a hold or showed frustration when thrown would be made to repeat the drill again and again until his reactions were dulled into quiet resilience. When the physical training was paused, the boys moved to the mess hall. There was no leisurely transition. The boys filed in quickly, maintaining order, their bodies aching and slick with morning sweat. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was served without ceremony. It was often a bowl of black broth, thick, salty, and metallic, brewed from pig's blood and vinegar. Accompanying it was a small hunk of barley bread or dried figs. They sat on the floor in rows, backs straight, eyes down. No one spoke unless ordered to. Eating was not social. It was a necessity, an opportunity to refuel before more demands were placed on their bodies. Each boy had to eat everything given to him. Nothing could be left behind. Wastefulness was a sin, and so too was obvious hunger. They were expected to be satisfied with little, to show neither greed nor discontent. Hunger was constant, but expressing it was dangerous. If a boy was seen as too eager or too slow to share, he might be accused of gluttony. Conversely, if he seemed ungrateful or careless with his food, he would go without at the next meal. This taught the boys a fine balance between restraint and survival, a tightrope of control that defined every moment in the agoge. Once the meal was finished, it was time for lessons, but these were not the lectures and scrolls of Athenian schools. In Sparta, education meant learning through hardship, action, and obedience. They memorized poetry, particularly the martial verses of Tartiers, which extolled the virtues of courage and death in battle. They practiced speaking with brevity, delivering sharp, laconic phrases that revealed intelligence without indulgence. A clever answer in few words was praised. A rambling reply was punished. Even their use of language was part of their training to be warriors, not only of the body, but of the mind. After recitations came observation drills. The boys were taken to overlook the surrounding hills and taught to spot movement, track the wind, and recognize the sounds of animals or distant feet. This was part of their early indoctrination into stealth and reconnaissance. Even at a young age, the boys were being prepared for the cryptia, the secretive missions that awaited the most capable among them in adolescence. These drills taught them to see without being seen, to watch without needing to ask. In Sparta, knowing when to speak and when not, too, was a skill as valued as wielding a sword. The mid-morning hours returned the boys to combat training, often using wooden swords or spears against dummies or each other. The injuries were real, the stakes high. A misstep could mean a broken finger, a bruised rib, or worse, but no one was allowed to stop. Bandages were applied only after drills were complete. Blood on a tunic was a badge of effort, not a reason for rest. The instructors watched closely for signs of fatigue or hesitation. Those who faltered were set apart and drilled again. It was in these moments that the boys learned to separate their will from their pain. By the time midday arrived, the boys were exhausted, yet no sign of weakness was permitted. Their muscles ached, their hands blistered, but their faces remained still. Rest came only in the smallest increments, few stolen moments in the shade, or while walking in tight formation from one area to another. There were no naps, no games. Leisure was a foreign concept. Even stillness was purposeful, designed to train posture, self-control, and attentiveness. The day had just begun, and for a Spartan boy in the agoge, it would be many hours before sleep offered any escape. Food in the Spartan barracks was not merely nourishment, it was ideology served in a bowl. The meals, sparse and repetitive, reflected the core values of the agoge: discipline, restraint, and survival. The most infamous dish was melas zomos, or black broth, made from pig's blood, vinegar, and salt. For outsiders, the taste was revolting. For Spartans, it was a symbol. To eat it without complaint marked the beginning of mastery over one's body and instincts. It dulled the senses, suppressed desire, and reminded every boy that indulgence was the first step toward decay. Mealtimes were highly regulated, beginning with a silent gathering in the austere mess hall. Boys sat in assigned places on the cold floor, their legs crossed, hands in their laps, backs erect like spears in a phalanx. There were no plates or personal utensils, only shared wooden bowls from which everyone ate in turn. The practice taught humility and fostered unity. Each boy had to monitor his own hunger and ensure that others received their share. Taking too much or eating too quickly wasn't just impolite. It was a moral failing, an affront to the collective discipline of the group. The food itself never changed. Day after day, the boys were served barley bread, black broth, olives, sometimes a bit of cheese or dried figs if supplies allowed. Meat was rare and seen as a luxury, more often a test than a treat. Occasionally, an instructor might bring in a roasted hare or small game bird and place it temptingly in front of the boys with no intention of sharing. The purpose was not to reward, but to provoke, to observe who stared too long, who licked their lips, who could not suppress their craving. Averted eyes and stoic expressions earned silent approval. Hunger, after all, was a lifelong companion of the Spartan warrior. Yet, in this austere culinary environment, an odd contradiction emerged. Boys were expected to steal, not as an act of defiance, but as a test of cunning and stealth. The agoge encouraged boys to sneak extra rations, swipe bits of food from the storeroom, or pilfer a crust of bread from another cohort's basket, but only if they could do so without being caught. If successful, the theft was quietly accepted. If caught, the boy was beaten not for stealing, but for failing. The lesson was clear. Resourcefulness was prized, but incompetence was punished. This practice bred an entire layer of strategy into daily life. Boys formed packs to distract monitors, to smuggle scraps under their cloaks, to barter favors for a chance at extra nourishment. Yet these alliances were fragile, always under the threat of betrayal or discovery. Trust was conditional, and success fleeting. It was a game of nerves and timing, sharpened by the awareness that even the smallest mistake could lead to public humiliation. The food, in this way, became more than sustenance. It was a stage upon which each boy demonstrated his capacity for independence under pressure. Despite the discomfort, or perhaps because of it, the communal meals were a source of identity. Each cohort developed a rhythm: who served, who stirred the broth, who distributed the bread. The routine offered structure, and within that structure, a subtle kind of belonging. The boys learned to watch out for one another, to pass a spoon without words, to notice when someone hadn't received enough and quietly shift their own share. Compassion was never praised, but it was quietly allowed to exist in the cracks of the system. Where the rules enforced hardness, the boys themselves sometimes practiced softness in secret. The mess hall was also a place of learning. Between bites, boys were tested on poetry and proverbs, or quizzed on military history. Sometimes an older boy would ask a question aloud, and the others had to respond with quick, clever answers. The pedanamoitha, official instructors, listened from the sidelines, measuring not just the correctness of a reply, but its delivery. Witty, brief responses were valued over thorough ones. It wasn't enough to know the answer. A Spartan had to say it with confidence and clarity. Thus, even eating became an extension of training, another arena where discipline met expression. Cleanup followed immediately, performed without instruction. Boys rinsed the bowls in cold water, swept the floor with bundled reeds, and reorganized the sparse kitchen supplies. There was no reward for efficiency, only punishment for delay. The tasks were rotated, forcing each boy to serve and to clean, to carry and to scrub. There were no favorites. Every role, no matter how menial, was meant to remind them that they were equals, bonded not by preference but by shared purpose. The lack of hierarchy in these chores was deliberate, a contrast to the rigid authority found in training. Everyone suffered together. Everyone endured together. Sometimes, late at night, the boys would whisper to one another about food. Not dreams of feasts or sweets. They hardly remembered such things but of slight indulgences. A roasted onion, a handful of walnuts, a warm cake of barley. These soft-spoken fantasies were fleeting and dangerous, yet they revealed the flicker of childhood that still remained. They didn't complain aloud, but in the privacy of darkness, desire had a voice. And though they would rise again the next day to the same bitter broth and dry bread, that shared yearning bonded them in a way that even training could not. Over time, hunger ceased to feel like a lack and became a constant presence, a companion that sharpened the senses and tempered the soul. Spartan boys learned to live on the edge of need, to treat food not as pleasure but as function, and when they finally graduated the agoge, they carried that lesson into adulthood. In battle, they would not falter from want. In hardship, they would not break from deprivation. They had been shaped by scarcity, molded by ritual denial. And in that denial, they had found endurance, the unyielding core of what it meant to be Spartan. From the moment a Spartan boy stepped into the agoge, his body was no longer his own. It belonged to the state, and the state had plans for it. Physical training was relentless, varied, and exhaustive. The body was to be sharpened like a blade honed, not just for war, but for the grueling rhythms of Spartan life. Each day brought new drills and exercises designed to test every joint, muscle, and nerve. There was no soft start, no warm-up phase. Boys were pushed to their limits from the outset, expected to adapt not through careful progression, but through sheer will and repetition. The training yard was a constant crucible. Wrestling, foot races, javelin throwing, and hand-to-hand combat formed the core of daily routines. Wrestling, in particular, held pride of place. Boys grappled barefoot in the dirt, their tunics soaked with sweat, their limbs bruised from repeated collisions. Victory earned little more than a nod. Loss was a lesson written in aching ribs and scraped skin. But what mattered more than victory or loss was how one bore the pain. Wincing, limping, or drawing attention to an injury could draw ridicule or punishment. Suffering was not hidden, it was expected, but it had to be endured in silence. Discipline governed every movement. There was no space for laziness, no time for recovery unless it was ordered. Running drills could stretch for hours, especially under the midday sun, when the heat beat down upon the boys like a second instructor. Their feet bled on the gravel paths, yet shoes were forbidden. The calluses that formed were badges of progress. Climbing exercises followed up ropes, over walls, across beams, and failure meant falling onto hard-packed earth. There were no cushions, no one to catch you. The earth was your lesson, and your bruises its grammar. Punishment was not reserved for disobedience alone. It was woven into the rhythm of training. A poorly executed throw, a missed block, a sluggish reaction any could result in lashes from a switch or orders to run additional laps. The switch, often cut from olive branches, was wielded by older boys with stern detachment. They had once endured the same treatment and now delivered it with the same dispassion. There was no malice in these strikes. They were not expressions of anger, but tools of instruction, each lash a syllable in Sparta's brutal language of improvement. The boys were not trained for individual combat, but for coordinated warfare. Formation drills were key. Standing shoulder to shoulder, they practiced phalanx movements with wooden spears and shields. The goal was not glory for oneself, but unity. They learned to move as one body, to follow commands instantly and without hesitation. Any misstep, any lag in response, jeopardized the whole. They drilled until their shoulders ached, until their muscles trembled, until each movement became reflex. Even their breathing was trained to synchronize in marches, echoing the collective heartbeat of Sparta. Injury was inevitable, but sympathy was rare. A twisted ankle, a dislocated finger, a broken nose, these were treated with minimal attention. The boys wrapped their own wounds or helped one another, but were expected to continue training unless physically unable to stand. Complaining brought shame and often further punishment. Those who bore their wounds quietly were noted. Strength was measured not just in endurance, but in silence. To bleed was common. To bleed quietly was Spartan. Not all discipline was physical. The boys were subjected to mental and emotional trials as well. They might be ordered to stand still for hours under the sun, or to hold a position in absolute silence while flies crawled over their faces. These exercises were designed to teach patience, control, and the suppression of instinct. A sudden sneeze, a twitch, or a glance out of formation could undo hours of effort. The instructors were unforgiving, watching for the smallest falter. But those who succeeded in these stillness trials gained a deep, inward strength, a kind of calm forged in heat and hunger. There were also competition-structured challenges that combined athleticism and discipline. Foot races through rocky terrain, endurance tests beneath the weight of wooden logs, wrestling matches that lasted until one boy could no longer rise. These contests were not for entertainment, but for measurement. The instructors recorded who was fastest, who endured longest, who broke first. Yet the results were not always shared. Praise was rare, and reward even rarer. The boys learned to strive without expectation, to pursue excellence, not for recognition, but because excellence was expected. One of the most feared and revered training rituals was the whipping contest, held in honor of Artemis Orthia. Boys were whipped before an altar, not as punishment, but as spectacle. They were to withstand the lashes without flinching, often until they collapsed or lost consciousness. The entire city watched. It was considered an honor to endure the longest. Some died from the ordeal, their blood soaking the altar stone. To die without crying out was seen as the ultimate proof of Spartan virtue, a death that cemented one's name in whispered respect among the barracks. Through it all, the boys were molded not into soldiers of skill alone, but into warriors of obedience and instinct. Their training stripped away the unnecessary emotion, hesitation, weakness, and replaced it with reaction, unity, and silence. Their bodies bore the marks of the forge, scars, calluses, crooked fingers, but it was their eyes that revealed the true transformation. Eyes that no longer searched for comfort or escape. Eyes that no longer questioned orders. Eyes that had stared into discipline and become one with it. In Sparta, to be trained was to be reborn, not into freedom, but into purpose. In the agoge, pain was not an unfortunate consequence. It was a deliberate, essential component of education. The Spartan system believed that true strength was found not only in muscles or martial skill, but in the mind's ability to override the body's instinct to retreat, to weep, to scream. Every lesson was wrapped in discomfort, and every act of growth was born through some measure of suffering. For the boys in the barracks, pain was their most consistent instructor. It sharpened their reflexes, molded their posture, and etched endurance into their bones. Whippings were a common and expected part of daily life. They were administered for infractions ranging from poor posture to sluggishness during drills. But they were also used preventatively to to harden the spirit. Some beatings were public, carried out before the assembled cohorts to reinforce obedience. Others took place in private, meant to correct subtle weaknesses or to remind a boy that softness would not go unnoticed. The blows were not random. They were timed and measured, deliberate in rhythm. A boy learned to stand still through each one, to fix his gaze ahead and keep his voice locked in his chest. The famous altar of Artemis Orthia served as the pinnacle of this painful education. Every year, boys from the agoge were brought before the altar to be ritually flogged in front of the city. It was a religious rite, but also a public trial of courage. The object was not survival, it was silence. Boys were whipped until they bled, until the sand around their feet turned black. They gripped wooden idols or clenched their fists, and the crowd watched for flinches, for cries, for any sign that the mind had broken before the body. Those who endured were honored. Those who collapsed were forgotten, or worse, shamed. Yet it was not the pain itself that was sacred to Sparta, but the will to endure it. Pain was seen as a tula forge for courage, an acid that dissolved fear. A boy who could smile after punishment, who could help another stand after being whipped, who could walk steadily back to his place in line. These were the signs of readiness. The instructors did not praise these moments. Praise could soften the boy, but the silence that followed the knowing nod, the absence of further correction, was its own reward, a currency of quiet acknowledgement passed between the broken and the unbreakable. The boys quickly learned that resisting pain physically was less important than mastering it inwardly. There was no point in flinching, it only encouraged more. Instead, they trained themselves to retreat inward, to shrink the world to a single breath, a single heartbeat. Older trainees taught the younger ones mental tricks, how to count slowly through each strike, how to fix their eyes on a speck of dirt on the wall, how to imagine themselves standing outside their bodies. These were the skills not found in scrolls or classrooms, but in the echo of footsteps, walking away after punishment. Beyond whippings, other trials tested their limits. Some days the boys were ordered to stand motionless for hours under the blazing sun or the cold lash of wind, maintaining rigid posture despite stinging eyes and cramping limbs. At other times, they were forced to kneel on rough gravel until their legs went numb, or to hold heavy stones overhead until their arms gave out. These exercises were not about strength. They were about control. How long could one suppress the urge to fall, to scream, to stop? The instructors watched closely, not to punish the weak, but to find the strong. There were also emotional trials. Sometimes a boy would be deliberately isolated, denied food, or excluded from group activities. The others were forbidden to speak to him. This was not for any real wrongdoing. It was a test of resilience in loneliness. Could he endure the silence of his brothers? Could he maintain his discipline without the rhythm of communal life? For boys who had known little love and even less comfort, the removal of belonging could be devastating. But those who returned to the group without complaint, who rejoined the formation without bitterness, were marked as having passed one of the most difficult tests of all. Pain also shaped relationships. Boys who shared the experience of punishment often developed quiet bonds. There was no hugging, no spoken sympathy, but there might be a hand placed on a shoulder, a nod passed during inspection, or a shared glance during the next flogging. These small gestures became lifelines in an otherwise brutal environment. They were not signs of weakness, but of solidarity. Through pain, The boys learned to recognize suffering in others, to hold space for it, without needing to name it. The brotherhood forged in the agoge was not sentimental, it was sacramental. In rare moments, instructors would share the purpose behind these lessons. A warrior who cannot endure pain is a danger to his line. They would say, he will falter, he will fail his brothers. Better to break here, among us, than later, on the field. These explanations were not given often, and never kindly, but when spoken, they carried weight. The boys did not need to be convinced that pain had meaning. They had already begun to see it etched into their bodies, into the stiffened backs and careful gaits of their peers. They wore their bruises like ink, each one writing a line in their becoming. And so the cycle continued. Each day brought new trials, each trial a new chance to master the body through the mind. Pain was never absent, but it grew familiar. It lost its power to shock, and instead became something steady, something known. The boys grew quieter, more focused. Their gazes hardened. Their movements became deliberate. They no longer feared pain. They expected it. And in that expectation, they found the very thing Sparta had sought to instill from the beginning. A man who could not be broken, only shaped. Though the Spartan agoge was built upon hardship and isolation, it was within this crucible that one of its most enduring features took form: brotherhood. From the earliest days, boys were grouped not as individuals, but as units, cohorts that lived, trained, suffered, and competed together. These units were the seeds of the phalanx, the legendary Spartan war formation where each man's shield protected the next. But long before battlefields, this unity was forged in the dust and silence of the barracks, born out of necessity and tested by rivalry. In this strange fusion of competition and camaraderie, the boys learned that to survive meant to belong. Each cohort functioned as a microcosm of the Spartan ideal. Every boy was responsible, not just for himself, but for the cohesion of the group. Tasks were shared: fetching water, maintaining weapons, tending to wounds. A boy who failed in his duty didn't just fail himself, he weakened the group. Instructors watched for cohesion as carefully as they watched for skill. Did the boys share evenly? Did they cover for each other's mistakes? Did they move as one during drills? A cohesive unit was praised, albeit silently, with fewer punishments. A fractured one endured more, not out of cruelty, but to reinforce the need for unity. And yet, within this enforced unity, fierce competition thrived. Boys were constantly ranked publicly and mercilessly. The strongest, fastest, and most disciplined rose to the top. The weakest were noted, corrected, or punished. This wasn't just about ability, it was about standing. Rankings affected everything: who led the exercises, who received first pick of rations, who bore the heaviest responsibilities. The rankings were fluid, always changing, always being tested. One moment of weakness, one missed strike in a sparring match, and a boy could plummet. This ensured a constant drive to improve, to outdo, to climb. Despite the competition, betrayal was rare. The agoge didn't reward sabotage, it rewarded excellence under pressure. A boy who sabotaged a peer risked group punishment, and more importantly, the trust of his brothers. Instead, competition created mutual elevation. The stronger boys drove the weaker to rise. There was rivalry, yes, but a rivalry rooted in respect. Sparring matches ended with firm nods, not gloating. A well-landed blow earned admiration even from the one struck. And when drills ended, boys who moments ago were grappling in the dirt now walked side by side, comparing bruises like scholars comparing notes. Shared suffering was the mortar of brotherhood. The endless drills, the hunger, the punishments, these created a bond that no words could truly define. It was common to see a boy silently help another to his feet after a beating, or to find a hidden piece of bread placed near a friend's sleeping mat. These gestures were never acknowledged aloud. Kindness was not celebrated, but it was deeply felt. Over time, these boys, stripped of family, of softness, of individuality, became more than comrades. They became extensions of one another, living proof of Sparta's belief that the whole was always greater than the sum of its parts. Nicknames emerged among the cohorts, spoken softly at night or muttered during drills. These names often referenced a boy's strength, his speed, a habit, or a notable scar. Boar, stone, runner, shadow. Each name was a quiet symbol of acceptance. Earning a nickname meant being seen, acknowledged by the group. And in a world that prized anonymity in service of unity, such acknowledgement was powerful. It meant a boy had become indispensable, a thread in the fabric of his cohort. These names rarely left the barracks, but they lived on in memory, carried forward long after the boys became men. Tests of loyalty were sometimes administered without warning. An instructor might accuse one boy of wrongdoing and ask another to confirm it. The response was a test not just of honesty, but of judgment. Would the boy protect his comrade? Would he remain silent, even under threat of punishment? There was no correct answer, only revelation. The instructors wanted to see what kind of warrior stood before them, loyal to truth or loyal to his brothers. The outcome rarely mattered as much as the manner in which it was delivered. A boy who hesitated, who chose words carefully, who showed internal struggle, he was remembered. Nighttime, the only reprieve from movement, was often when the bonds deepened. The boys whispered stories, recalled home, or spoke of future battles and imagined glories. They shared fears quietly, obliquely, through metaphors or memories. Laughter was rare, but not absent. A clever comment, a shared memory of an instructor's mistake, or a mimicry of a comrade's peculiar habit could ignite a flicker of joy. These moments were fleeting, often cut short by the presence of older monitors, but they lingered in the silence afterward like embers. In a world that demanded stone, the boys learned to kindle warmth in shadows. Occasionally, groups of cohorts were pitted against each other in contests, relay races, formation drills, obstacle courses. These events were intense, fiercely fought. Victory brought no prizes, only reduced punishments or momentary favor. But the pride of winning as a group was immense. A victorious cohort might walk back to the barracks in unison, heads high, steps synchronized. They would not cheer or gloat, but their silence was louder than words. For that day, they had proven themselves together. The losers bore their shame quietly, vowing to do better next time. Failure stung, not because of personal defeat, but because it let down the brotherhood. As the years passed, and the boys grew into young men, the bonds formed in the barracks proved unbreakable. These were not friendships in the modern sense. They were deeper, forged in the fire of daily trial and mutual reliance. When these young men eventually entered the phalanx, when they stood shield to shield in the face of death, they did so not merely as soldiers, but as brothers. They had learned through hunger, pain, and relentless discipline that a Spartan's strength did not reside in himself alone. It lived in the line, in the unity of movement, in the silent, enduring presence of those who had grown beside him. One of the most defining, yet often misunderstood aspects of the Spartan agoge was the institution of mentorship, a structured relationship between a younger trainee and an older youth, often referred to as the iron or older brother. Far from casual companionship, this pairing was fundamental to Spartan education. It was mentorship with purpose, crafted to instill virtue, courage, and discipline through example and proximity. Every boy, upon entering the agoge, could expect to be observed, chosen, and eventually guided by someone further along the same path, a figure, not unlike a shadow, equal parts guide and mirror. These older brothers were typically between 18 and 20, nearing the end of their own training. Having endured the same gauntlet of hardship, they now bore the responsibility of shaping the next generation. Selection was not random. An older youth might choose a younger boy who reminded him of himself, bold, quiet, clumsy, promising. The boy, for his part, had no say. The bond formed quickly and with little ceremony. From that moment onward, the older brother took on the role of protector, critic, tutor, and example. It was an unspoken vow. I have suffered before you, and now I will guide you through it. Daily life was infused with the mentor's presence. The older brother taught not by lecture, but by demonstration, how to walk silently, how to respond to an insult, how to strike quickly in a fight. He would correct the younger boy's mistakes, not always gently, but with a clarity that carved the lesson deep. Sometimes it was a slap to the back of the head during drills, other times a whispered word before an inspection. There was no affection in the modern sense. Praise was rare, touch even rarer. But the younger boy learned to value the glance, the nod, the moment of correction. These were the breadcrumbs of approval, scattered sparingly. Mentorship also meant accountability. If a younger boy failed in his duties, slacked during a drill, broke formation, or fell behind in discipline, the older brother was held responsible. This was not symbolic. He could be punished for the younger boy's shortcomings, and often was. Instructors believed this pressure forged not only better juniors, but more vigilant seniors. The older brother had to watch constantly, to anticipate failure before it occurred. He became both coach and conscience, and in this dynamic, the younger boy learned vigilance, not from authority, but from example. The relationship was hierarchical, yet oddly intimate. The older brother was not merely a drill sergeant or a teacher. He became the boy's primary model for what a Spartan should be. In moments of doubt or fear, the boy would look to him not for comfort, but for steadiness. If the older brother stood unflinching through a flogging, the younger would learn to do the same. If he bore hunger with silence or exhaustion with resolve, the lesson struck deeper than any lecture. The younger boy absorbed not just behavior, but bearing. His identity was shaped by watching someone who had survived the same fires. In some cases, the bond between older and younger developed into something closer. Ancient sources suggest that many of these relationships were romantic or even erotic in nature, though not in the way modern societies might understand. In Sparta, such attachments were seen not as deviant, but as spiritually and socially productive. The older partner was expected to love the younger, not for pleasure, but for the elevation of his soul and strength. The younger, in turn, was to respect and emulate his elder. These bonds, where they existed, were not scandalous. They were a continuation of mentorship in emotional and moral dimensions. The emotional terrain of these relationships varied. Some were cold, disciplinary bonds built on stern authority. Others developed warmth and deep trust. A younger boy might silently follow his mentor for years, watching, listening, absorbing. In the barracks at night, the two might speak in low tones, discussing tactics, fears, memories. These conversations were not idle chatter. They were moments of transmission of values, of strategies, of identity. The older brother did not comfort the younger with soft words, but with shared clarity. This is what it means to be a Spartan. This is how you endure. Occasionally, older brothers failed. They became lax, cruel, or indifferent. When this happened, instructors intervened, reassigning boys or punishing mentors for neglect. The system, though personal, was not sentimental. It existed to maintain Spartan strength, not emotional security. But such failures were rare. Most older brothers took their roles seriously, knowing that their legacy lived in the boys they shaped. To fail one's brother was to tarnish one's own worth. And in Sparta, worth was not a private possession, it was a public currency, constantly measured. As the younger boy grew, so too did the dynamic. By the time he reached adolescence, he began to reflect what he had learned. His movements became sharper, his responses quicker, his gaze steadier. The older brother would notice, and though he might never say it, the shift marked a quiet rite of passage. Eventually, the older youth would leave the barracks to join the Sisishitha, communal dining groups of full citizen warriors, and the younger boy would be left behind. Now the one others looked to. The cycle repeated. The student became the mentor. The flame passed from hand to hand. Through these structured, intense relationships, Sparta cultivated more than fighters. It built a lineage of behavior, a chain of character passed down through skin and silence. The older brother was not a parent, not a teacher, not a friend, but something stranger and perhaps more powerful, a mirror into a possible future. And in gazing into that mirror, the boy did not see who he was, but who he must become. Among the many virtues instilled in Spartan boys, silence held a place of unusual reverence. In a society where war was sacred and speech was weaponized, the ability to remain silent was not seen as a passive trait, but as an active discipline. It was not simply about refraining from talking, it was about training the mind to think before speaking. To measure one's words like a soldier measures the reach of his spear. From their earliest days in the agoge, boys were taught that words had weight, and that the heavier the word, the fewer should be used. This doctrine gave birth to the legendary Spartan laconic wit, short, sharp remarks that cut to the core. To speak too much was to reveal too much of your fears, your thoughts, your weaknesses. In the barracks, chatter was discouraged. Boys were not forbidden from speaking, but they quickly learned that anything said needed to be worthwhile. Instructors posed questions with traps embedded in them, and the boys were judged not just on correctness, but on how concisely they answered. Brevity became both shield and sword. A boy who rambled risked punishment, but a boy who answered cleverly in 5 words earned respect. Drills often included exercises in silence. A boy might be told to stand guard over a symbolic object, empty helmet. A wooden spearhand remained still and silent for hours. Passersby might mock him, jostle him, even test his resolve with whispered insults. If he reacted, he failed. If he remained unmoved, he was praised in silence. These tests were not just about resisting the urge to speak, they were about controlling the entire body, resisting the need to explain, to correct, to protest. This was how Sparta prepared boys to be warriors who could hold the line without flinching under chaos. Even social rituals were infused with this expectation of restraint. During meals, boys spoke only when prompted. During evening recollections, they could recount stories or fables, but only with permission, and only if their words carried meaning. Instructors might ask a boy to describe a moral lesson, but limit him to a single sentence. This was not cruelty, was training in discipline of thought. Every word had to be carved carefully, like a soldier sharpening his blade before battle. A careless phrase was as dangerous as a loose grip in the phalanx. This verbal economy became cultural currency. The Spartans were infamous throughout Greece for their cutting one-liners, often delivered in moments of high tension. When told that Persian arrows would blot out the sun, a Spartan replied, "Then we shall fight in the shade." When a foreign envoy asked them to submit, the Spartans simply said, if these phrases were not accidental, they were products of an upbringing that forged minds as sharply as bodies. To speak like a Spartan was to declare mastery over emotion, fear, and ego. Among the boys, silence also shaped relationships. Bonds formed not through conversation, but through shared glances, brief nods, and the occasional wordless gesture. A hand reaching out to steady a brother after a punishing drill. A piece of bread left without comment near a bruised comrade's mat. These acts spoke louder than any sentence could. In an environment where everyone suffered in silence, small kindnesses glowed like embers in the dark, and the absence of noise made those embers all the brighter. Silence was also used as punishment, and powerfully so. A boy who failed in discipline might be subjected to social silence, not spoken to by peers or mentors for days. The weight of exclusion, of invisibility, was a crushing burden in a system that demanded unity. These silent treatments were not violent, but they were deeply effective. The boy would strive to correct his behavior, not out of fear of physical pain, but to rejoin the rhythm of the group, to earn once more the quiet nod, the shared look, the sparse and sacred word. In rare moments, speech was allowed to bloom, but only to reveal excellence. Once a week, during evening assemblies, boys might be asked to recite a poem or share a moral judgment. Those chosen to speak prepared their lines with great care. Every syllable mattered. A clever answer could earn quiet admiration from instructors and peers alike, while a foolish one might become the subject of mockery or punishment. But when a boy spoke well, his voice was calm, deliberate, and sharp, it echoed longer than a roar in any other city-state. The culture of silence did not end with the agoge. Full-grown Spartans, even in the assembly or on campaign, were known for their tight-lipped demeanor. Generals issued commands in the fewest words possible. Warriors communicated with gestures and brief phrases. Silence was not just a practice of boys, but the armor of men. It guarded their thoughts, focused their minds, and gave their speech a weight that others could not match. In Sparta, a single word from a man could carry more meaning than a speech from a king. And so, from the cold floors of the barracks to the sunlit battlefields of Greece, silence followed the Spartan boy like a shadow. It grew with him, hardened with him, and in time became indistinguishable from his identity. He did not need to shout to command fear, nor to weep to express sorrow. His stillness spoke for him. His silence was his strength. And in a world that often mistook noise for power, the Spartan stood quiet, unreadable, unshaken proof that a single steady breath could echo louder than 1,000 cries. As the midday sun passed its zenith and began its slow descent behind the ridges of Mount Taygetus, the rhythm of life within the Spartan barracks shifted. The morning had been filled with the sting of drills, the burn of discipline, the clatter of training spears. But the afternoon brought a different tempo, not rest, but a reorientation. Where the morning had shaped the body, the afternoon was for the sharpening of other faculties. These hours were quieter, more varied, yet still infused with the constant undertow of purpose. No moment was idle. No activity was without instruction. The first task after midday was practical chores. Though Sparta despised excess and valued austerity, it was a deeply ordered society. Cleanliness, organization, and utility were central to the agoge structure. Boys swept their barracks with reed brooms, gathered firewood for the evening, scrubbed the shared bowls, and repaired worn-out sandals and tunics. There were no slaves to tend to them here. The helot class labored in the fields, but within the barracks, every boy learned to mend what he used and maintain what he needed. Pride in physical strength extended to pride in discipline, and orderliness was a form of strength. Tasks were often assigned in rotating pairs, forcing boys to work closely with others they may not have preferred. This was intentional. The instructors wanted every boy to learn the patience and coordination required for unit life. There could be no permanent rivals, no fixed allies. One day you scrubbed a floor with the boy you bested in wrestling. The next, you sewed a torn tunic beside the one who had caught you stealing bread. Each task became a quiet lesson in humility, cooperation, and self-control. You could not hold a grudge and stitch clean lines at the same time. Once chores were complete, the boys might be taken outside the city walls to gather materials from the surrounding countryside. This served dual purposes: resource collection and environmental familiarity. They collected reeds for bedding, herbs for communal meals, and occasionally hunted small game. These excursions introduced them to the terrain they might one day fight upon. Older trainees would point out game trails, landmarks, or routes for silent movement. While outwardly mundane, these trips planted the seeds of reconnaissance and resourcefulness traits critical to Spartan warfare. Upon returning, the next phase began: instruction. Though Sparta was not known for academic excellence in the Athenian sense, the afternoon often included brief lessons in literacy, law, and poetry. Boys memorized select verses from Homer, especially those emphasizing martial virtue, loyalty, and sacrifice. They copied legal maxims onto slate tablets, reciting them aloud in groups until every syllable was embedded in memory. Literacy served a functional purpose: reading orders, laws, and sacred texts, but it was also a means of reinforcing the moral framework of Spartan life. Every story was a parable, every line of verse a model for conduct. Occasionally, guest instructors, older Spartans, often retired warriors, would visit to deliver moral instruction. These men were living embodiments of the ideals the boys were expected to emulate: silent, scarred, and dignified. They would speak little, perhaps a short tale of battle or an anecdote about duty, followed by questions designed to test character. What would you do if a brother fled the line? Is it braver to fight alone or die beside your unit? These sessions were not debates. They were opportunities for boys to demonstrate that they had internalized Spartan values and to be corrected sharply if they had not. The last structured component of the afternoon was the group discussion. While still heavily supervised, this time was slightly more relaxed. Boys might be allowed to talk quietly in groups, reflect on the day's lessons, or even share personal thoughts within the strict boundaries of Spartan decorum. These sessions often revealed which boys were emerging as leaders. Some listened more than they spoke. Others guided the conversation, with questions that revealed deeper understanding. The instructors watched, not interfering, cataloging the subtle hierarchies forming among the group: who was trusted, who was followed, who commanded respect without force. During these discussions, the older boys might administer small rhetorical challenges. How would you defeat an enemy twice your size? What's more dangerous, fear or hunger? The younger boys were expected to answer briefly, insightfully, without stammering. Those who succeeded were marked as promising. Those who failed learned the cost of unpreparedness. But no one was allowed to remain silent. Even the quietest were drawn out, forced to confront their thoughts and express them clearly. This verbal sparring mirrored their physical training. It was not enough to be strong. One had to think, to judge, to speak with precision. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened across the training yard, and a hush settled over the barracks. The last duties of the day were symbolic but essential. Weapons were cleaned and arranged. Tunics were folded. The barracks were swept one last time. These acts, done in silence and synchrony, were reminders of ritual. Discipline did not end with the fading light. Even sleep was earned through order. Boys moved more slowly, now bodies sore, minds full, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the repetition. The structure was a kind of comfort, the only one allowed. And then, as dusk bled into darkness, the boys gathered for the evening meal, and soon after they would return to their mats of reeds. The barracks quieted once more, but their work was not finished. In dreams, they revisited drills, imagined glories, and remembered the small lessons hidden in the day's tasks. For in Sparta, even the quietest moments bore the weight of intention. The afternoon was not for rest, but for reflection, for weaving together the physical, moral, and mental fibers that would one day make a Spartan whole. There was a shadow that ran alongside the structured life of the agoge, darker and more secretive than the drills and rituals that defined a Spartan boy's visible training. It was spoken of in hushed tones, never officially acknowledged, and yet every boy knew of it: the cryptia. Not all would be chosen for this path only. The most cunning, disciplined, and fearless. To be selected was an honor, but one cloaked in dread. It meant a transition not only into manhood, but into something far colder, a weapon wielded in silence by the state itself. The cryptia was Sparta's covert institution, often described by outsiders as a secret police force, but in truth, it was something more primal. Its roots lay in control, specifically control over the helot population, the enslaved majority who farmed the land and supported the Spartan economy. Every year, the ephors, Sparta's senior magistrates, declared ritual war on the helots, allowing elite youths sanctioned violence under the guise of preserving order. The boys who entered the cryptia were tasked with blending into the countryside, spying on the helots, and eliminating those considered a threat without detection or ceremony. Those chosen were stripped of the remaining structure that the agoge provided. No more dormitories, no shared meals, no routine drills. Instead, they were cast into the wilderness with only a dagger, a cloak, and their wits. They were to travel by night, observe in silence, and report only to the highest authorities. These missions lasted weeks, sometimes months. There was no timeline, no fixed endpoint. Their success was not measured in numbers, but in invisibility. A member of the cryptia who was seen had failed. Their survival depended on moving like ghosts across the Laconian hills, watching, waiting, vanishing. This stage of training tested everything the agoge had attempted to instill: stealth, self-control, stamina, obedience, and above all, ruthlessness, without hesitation. It was one thing to endure a flogging without crying out. It was another to approach a sleeping stranger in the dark, draw your blade, and carry out an order in silence. Many believed this process was intended to deaden the soul, to remove the final vestiges of fear or empathy that might interfere with battlefield efficiency. Others saw it as a final filter, separating the merely strong from the unshakably loyal. Those who returned from the Cryptia seldom spoke of what they had done. The experience changed them. They walked differently, more alert, more deliberate. Their eyes were more distant, their speech more clipped. Other boys in the agoge regarded them with a strange mix of awe and unease. These were no longer peers, but initiates of an older, crueler brotherhood. They had stepped into the state's most intimate trust, having proven they could carry out orders that others would hesitate even to consider. And though they rejoined the ranks of trainees, their presence lingered like the echo of a whisper in a dark corridor. The Cryptia also served a political function. It reminded the Helot population that rebellion was not only futile, but suicidal. No corner of the land was safe from Spartan eyes. A Helot who spoke too boldly or grew too influential might vanish overnight, and no one would speak of it. This climate of fear kept the majority subjugated without open warfare. It was not justice, but utility, and the boys of the Cryptia were the instruments. Their work was brutal, but they believed it necessary. In their silence, they carried the weight of a society built upon control. Not every boy who went into the Cryptia returned. Some vanished into the landscape, victims of resistance, or starvation, or their own fear. Their absence was never discussed publicly. Instructors never named them, and no funerals were held. This, too, was part of the lesson. A Spartan's life was not his own to mourn. If he could not complete his duty, then he was not fit to be remembered. This cold logic ran through every vein of Spartan society, but nowhere was it more apparent than in the silence surrounding those lost in the darkness. For the boys still within the agoge, the existence of the Cryptia acted as a looming threshold. It was both a warning and a goal. Some feared it, hoping never to be chosen. Others trained harder, eager to prove themselves worthy of the state's secret trust. In either case, the effect was the same. The Cryptia haunted every boy's thoughts as he lay on his mat at night, wondering if he would one day be called to walk into the hills with nothing but a blade and a purpose whispered into his ear. To survive the Cryptia was to become something more than a soldier. It was to embody the purest essence of Spartan doctrine: obedience without hesitation, action without doubt, and silence without remorse. These were not values one could simply learn in drills. They had to be lived, tested, and survived. And in this crucible, a boy either broke or became unbreakable. In the end, the Cryptia was less an institution than a rite of transformation. It turned the hardest boys into the hardest men. It shaped the edge of the Spartan sword, unseen and unspoken. It was a shadow that moved beneath the city's order and pride, ensuring both. And for those who passed through it, the darkness never truly left. It became part of the cold, quiet place at the center of their being, where hesitation had been replaced by will. Though Sparta is remembered primarily for its iron discipline and martial prowess, the city-state was also deeply religious. Piety was not at odds with warfare. In fact, the two were intimately connected. Every element of Spartan life, from the structure of the agoge to the conduct of soldiers in battle, was infused with sacred obligation. The gods were not distant abstractions. They were present in every oath, every punishment, every training exercise. Religion in Sparta was not a matter of personal salvation. It was a tool of social cohesion, a reinforcement of discipline, and a divine justification for sacrifice. From their earliest days in the agoge, boys were made aware that their actions were being observed, not just by instructors, but by the gods themselves. Apollo, the god of order, music, and prophecy, was especially revered. His ideals, harmony, balance, self-control, were seen as the foundation of Spartan life. Boys were taught to align their actions with these values. Artemis, too, held a central place in the lives of the young. As the goddess of the hunt and protector of the young, she was honored through rites that were as brutal as they were sacred. Her temple at Orthia was the site of the infamous whipping contests, a ritual both religious and instructional. Daily routines began and ended with small acts of worship. Before dawn drills, boys would stand in formation and bow their heads in silent devotion. They would not pray aloud or make offerings individually. Instead, the collective offered its silence, its unity, its readiness as a living sacrifice to the divine. Meals were eaten with a sense of ritual as well. Before taking the first bite of barley bread or black broth, boys would nod in acknowledgement of the gods who made such sustenance possible. These acts were not spontaneous or emotional. They were learned behaviors, part of the choreography of Spartan life. Festivals marked the calendar year and provided moments of public display, not of joy, but of reinforced virtue. The Gymnopedia, for instance, was a central festival dedicated to Apollo, during which boys and men danced naked in the public square, displaying their physical strength, grace, and discipline. These dances were not frivolous. They were structured performances, rehearsed for weeks. To participate was an honor, and the performances were judged not on artistry, but on precision and stoicism. Laughter, mistakes, or signs of nervousness were frowned upon. Every movement was a testimony to one's mastery of self. Another important festival was the Carnia, held in honor of Apollo Carnios. It emphasized military order and pious reflection. During this time, mock battles and processions were held, blending the sacred and the martial. Boys participated in foot races and team contests that symbolized the coordination of the phalanx. They wore wreaths, not armor, but the symbolism was clear Spartan. Victory was rooted in obedience, and obedience was rooted in the divine. The line between sacred ritual and military training was not blurred in Sparta. It was non-existent. The gods watched every movement, judged every misstep. Sacrifice was a central act of Spartan worship, though it was practiced with characteristic restraint. Animals were slain before major military campaigns, and auguries were taken to determine the favor of the gods. Even boys were made familiar with the rituals of blood, how to hold the knife, how to burn the offering, how to read the smoke. These acts were performed not in temples of gold and marble, but in open-air altars, often at the edges of the city or in the wilderness. The setting reinforced a key Spartan belief. Divinity dwelled not in luxury, but in nature and endurance. Personal devotion, while present, was always subordinate to public duty. A boy who prayed fervently but disobeyed orders would be scorned, while one who observed the rites with calm precision and obeyed without question was admired. The gods, in Sparta's view, did not favor the eloquent supplicant, but the silent executor of duty. This belief shaped how religion was taught in the agoge. It was not a subject of abstract discussion. It was a living code, enforced through ritual and reinforced through repetition. To worship was to act correctly, not to feel correctly. Oracles and omens were respected, especially those from Delphi. Even boys were occasionally told stories of signs and portents, an eagle circling the barracks, a dream shared by multiple trainees. These tales were not dismissed as superstition, but treated with solemn curiosity. Such stories were tools for reflection, methods of aligning personal conduct with perceived divine will. A boy might be reminded of an omen before a difficult trial, encouraged to interpret his pain as a test sent by the gods. This theological framing gave deeper meaning to the relentless suffering of the agoge. Religion also provided rare moments of gentleness, festivals, where mothers brought offerings to Artemis for their sons, where songs were sung in praise of heroes long dead, where olive branches were woven into wreaths. These moments were brief and tightly controlled, but they hinted at an emotional world beneath the rigid exterior. Even Spartan boys, trained to silence and strength, felt the stirrings of something softer when a hymn echoed through the hills or a temple bell marked the turning of the season. The divine reminded them that they were not just warriors in training, but living instruments of a higher order. And so, religion, like every other element of Spartan life, served a purpose far beyond personal faith. It was the glue that held the system together, the invisible hand that shaped the soul, while the instructors shaped the body. Through ritual and rite, the gods were made present in every bruise, every chant, every step taken in unison. For the boys of the agoge, faith was not a refuge, it was a discipline, and in that discipline they found meaning, not only for their suffering, but for their future as the silent, obedient sons of Sparta. If the agoge was the forge that shaped the Spartan youth, then the sycessia, or communal mess hall, was the anvil upon which the bonds of citizenship were hammered. While boys in the agoge ate together out of necessity, adult Spartans dined together out of civic duty. The seeds of this lifelong tradition were planted early in the training process. By adolescence, boys were periodically allowed to observe or assist in the sycessia, catching glimpses of the world they would one day join. It was not a place of leisure, but a sacred institution, equal parts dining room, training ground, and moral arena. The mess hall was a sparse, rectangular room with stone floors and plain wooden benches arranged in a circle or square. In the center, a communal fire pit might burn more for light than warmth. There were no tapestries, no silver goblets, no music. Everything about the setting was designed to suppress ego and elevate the collective. Each mess consisted of about 15 men, and occasionally older youths close to completing their training. Membership was selective. Even adult men could be rejected if they did not earn the approval of their peers. For the boys still in the agoge, these gatherings served as a preview and a challenge. Food in the sycessia was prepared and served by helots, but the rituals of eating belonged entirely to the Spartans. Each man was expected to bring a monthly contribution: barley, wine, cheese, figs, and, when possible, meat. If a man failed to make his contribution through poverty, negligence, or cowardice, he was expelled. There were no exceptions, not even for kings. Boys in training absorbed this lesson early. Discipline did not end at the training yard. It followed you to the table. Consistency, responsibility, and humility were served alongside every bowl of broth. The meals themselves were solemn and orderly. Conversation was allowed, but it had rules: no bragging, no idle gossip, and absolutely no complaints. Younger boys, when invited to attend, spoke only when spoken to. They served the food, observed the rituals, and absorbed the behavior of their elders. These moments were not incidental. They were intentional steps in their education. A boy who served with grace and attentiveness earned notice. A boy who dropped a bowl or interrupted was remembered, and not fondly. The mess hall was a place of quiet judgment, where every gesture contributed to a lifelong reputation. Discussions at the Secessa often revolved around law, war, and ethics. Men shared stories of past campaigns, debated the merits of ancient warriors, or recited verses from Tartars. Humor was permitted, but it had to be sharp, laconic, and in line with Spartan taste. Witty insults were admired. Foolish chatter was met with silence. Boys who listened carefully could learn as much in an hour at the mess hall as they could in a week of drills. These conversations were part of their gradual transformation from passive listeners to active participants in the moral and military culture of Sparta. Initiation into a mess hall was a rite of passage as significant as completing the agoge. Boys who reached the age of 20 were eligible, but not guaranteed to join. They had to be nominated and unanimously accepted by the members of a mess. A single objection could block admission. This process underscored one of Sparta's core values. No man stood alone. Brotherhood had to be earned, not assumed. A youth might have excelled in training, but if he lacked grace at the table or failed to command the quiet respect of his peers, he would not be admitted. The humiliation of rejection was profound and lifelong. Once admitted, a man attended his Secessa nightly, unless on campaign. Absence without cause was unacceptable. The shared meal was more than sustenance. It was a reaffirmation of equality. In a city where wealth disparities existed but were downplayed, the mess hall functioned as a great leveler. All sat on the same benches, ate the same food, and spoke in turn. Even kings took their place without fanfare. This deep sense of unity, built through countless shared meals, forged a military bond unlike any other. When Spartans marched into battle, they did so beside those they had eaten with for years. For the boys still training, witnessing this ritualized equality was both inspiring and intimidating. They learned that Spartan excellence was not a sprint, but a lifelong journey. Strength alone would not secure one's place at the table. Character, consistency, and camaraderie mattered just as much. They saw how even the strongest warriors deferred to the silence of the group, how even veterans listened before they spoke. The mess hall was a daily demonstration that a Spartan's worth was not measured by his voice alone, but by how well he understood the rhythm of the collective. Even in its minimalism, the Secessa had moments of ceremony. Before eating, a libation of wine was poured, and a short hymn might be sung in honor of the gods. At certain festivals, small toasts were offered, not to personal achievements, but to fallen comrades or shared victories. These rituals reinforced the sacredness of the bond between men. They reminded everyone present that they were not just warriors or citizens, but custodians of a tradition that stretched back through generations. For the boys in attendance, these moments etched themselves into memory like verses on stone. And so, the Spartan mess hall stood as more than a dining room. It was the heartbeat of the warrior community, the place where boys became men and men became brothers. In its shadows and silences, lessons were passed without words. In its order and repetition, identities were formed not in isolation, but in unity. For the Spartan youth, the Secessa was both horizon and destination, a final proving ground, where strength was tempered by humility, and belonging was earned, not through victory, but through steadfastness at the table. In Sparta, pain was ever present, but what of injury and illness, those inevitable interruptions to even the strongest body? The answer was as harsh as the training that preceded it. To be injured was to be tested, not pitied. In a culture where endurance was worshipped and weakness shunned, a wound was not merely a physical setback, was a crucible in which a Spartan's character was revealed. From minor scrapes to broken limbs, the response expected of a boy was not complaint, but composure. The first lesson every trainee learned was that injury was not an excuse. It was an opportunity to show resolve. There was no infirmary in the Spartan barracks, no quiet rooms for recovery, no dedicated healers to tend to the wounded. The boys treated each other's wounds with whatever tools and knowledge they had been given, often passed down from older trainees. Cuts were rinsed in cold water. Dislocated joints were set with crude force. Rags served as bandages. The ethos was clear. The body must adapt or perish. Boys were discouraged from drawing attention to their injuries. Doing so risked not only punishment, but isolation. To be perceived as fragile was to fall behind in a system that rewarded only the unyielding. When serious injuries occurred, cracked ribs, deep lacerations, feverish illness, the instructors would evaluate the situation not with concern, but calculation. Was the boy still functional? Could he continue drills at reduced intensity? If so, he remained. If not, he was temporarily removed from the group, not to recover in comfort, but to train his endurance differently. Injured boys were sometimes given mental tasks, menial chores, or silent observation duties. They were never idle. Even at their weakest, they were expected to contribute, to demonstrate usefulness. Rest was not a right. It was a dangerous, slippery slope toward softness. Fever and sickness were even more complicated. While physical wounds had visible boundaries, illness invited suspicion. Was the boy truly sick or faking weakness? Could he be trusted to return to form, or had something internal broken that would never mend? In a society that prized outward control, the inner failings of the body were feared in silence. A sick boy who recovered quickly, without fuss, was silently commended. One who lingered in his ailment, or whose symptoms resisted clarity, found himself under a cloud of doubt. Compassion was withheld, not out of cruelty, but from the fear of contagion, not of disease, but of frailty. There was a subtle hierarchy among the injured. A broken arm earned more respect than a lingering cough. A visible scar told a story of endurance. A boy constantly rubbing his temple, claiming pain unseen, was less likely to be believed. This created a culture of stoic deception. Boys often hid injuries, continued drills on twisted ankles, or bound their own bleeding fingers beneath their cloaks. It wasn't bravery alone that drove this behavior, it was survival. To admit to pain was to gamble with one's standing. To ignore it was to stay in the formation, to remain among the strong. Still, Spartan instructors understood that even the toughest bodies had limits. A boy who collapsed during drills might be punished, but he would also be studied. Could he rise the next day? Would he return stronger, or retreat into himself? These moments were key turning points. Some boys broke entirely, their spirits cracked beyond repair. Others found in the lowest moment a strange kind of power, the realization that endurance was not about absence of pain, but the refusal to surrender to it. These boys often returned with a renewed sharpness, forged in the knowledge of their own fragility. Peer support played a quiet role in the recovery process. While open sympathy was forbidden, small acts of care slipped through the cracks. A boy might tighten a fellow's bandage during a long march, or subtly brace him during a difficult maneuver. These gestures were never acknowledged aloud, but they were remembered. Among brothers in training, there was an unspoken understanding. We will not speak of your pain, but we will help you through it. This code of quiet support balanced the system's cold expectations with the warmth of human connection, even in its most restrained form. Scars became silent trophies. There were no medals in Sparta, no public declarations of valor for enduring a broken nose or surviving a severe infection. But the boys noticed. They watched how a peer moved after recovery, how he carried himself. A limp could become a mark of pride if it was worn with dignity. An uneven grip might signal a story of survival. These visible signs of past suffering communicated volumes, building respect where words were forbidden. The body, marked by ordeal, became a living scroll of experience, each wound a line in the narrative of Spartan resilience. There were times, however, when injury marked the end of the road. A boy who could no longer participate, whose body failed to respond to treatment, might be quietly dismissed. There was no ceremony. He would be sent back to his family if he was deemed worthy or consigned to lesser duties, stripped of his path to citizenship. This fate was dreaded more than death. To be removed from the agoge was not simply a personal loss, but a familial shame. And so the boys trained harder, suffered longer, and masked their pain more skillfully, desperate to avoid the final judgment of unworthiness. Injury and illness were never merely physical events in the agoge. They were moments of existential reckoning tests, not just of the body, but of the boy's ability to exist within a system that demanded everything and forgave nothing. In surviving such trials, the youth did not merely heal, he was transformed. The body bore the scars, but the soul of it endured was now tempered steel, ready to serve a city that demanded perfection, yet defined it through survival. In Sparta, you did not become strong in spite of injury. You became strong through it. As the last sliver of sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of Mount Taygetus, the Spartan barracks sank into a strange quiet. Daylight, with its drills, shouts, and endless tests, gave way to a stillness that was not quite peace. The air cooled sharply after the heat of training, the scent of dust and sweat lingering in the darkness like a ghost of the day's rigor. But nightfall in the agoge was not a time of release. It was a continuation, more subdued, yes, but still bound by the ever-tight grip of discipline. Even sleep had to be earned, and even dreams were watched. There was no ceremony to mark the end of the day, no good nights, no lullabies, no shared tales to soothe the mind. The boys were expected to know the rhythm of the sun and respond without prompting. When the final task was done, be it cleaning weapons, sweeping the yard, or polishing their rough sandals, the boys returned in silence to their reed mats, laid out in even rows across the barrack floor. There were no pillows, no blankets, only cloaks, stiff from days of wear, wrapped tightly around bodies that trembled with fatigue. The floor beneath them was cold and hard. It was meant to be. Before lying down, a final inspection often took place. Instructors or older boys moved between the rows, watching for slouching shoulders, untucked tunics, or eyes that drifted. Even in these final moments, presentation mattered. A boy's final posture of the day reflected his character. He had to show that discipline had sunk into his bones, that fatigue had not unraveled his composure. A sloppy curl of the mat, a missed fold in the cloak, these could bring punishment. Even then, the lesson was eternal. There was no end to the expectation of perfection. Once the room dimmed, lit only by the faintest moonlight through slits in the stone walls, the boys were permitted to rest. But rest did not come easily. Bodies ached, skin burned from sun and switch, muscles twitched with exhaustion. Sleep arrived like a reluctant visitor, often ushered in by sheer physical collapse rather than comfort. And yet, for many boys, night was the most difficult part of the day. The silence, so rigidly enforced, became a chamber for thought. Here, there were no drills to drown out the voice inside. Here, memory crept in. Some boys lay still, staring into the dark, recalling the faces of mothers left behind. The soft bed of childhood now so distant, it seemed unreal. Others tried not to think at all, focusing instead on the rhythm of breath, the echo of drills in their bones, the man they were told they were becoming. Dreams came sporadically. When they came at all and were often fragments of battle, of faceless enemies, of endless marching. Few boys dreamed of peace. Even in their unconscious minds, Sparta had taken root. Occasionally, a whisper broke the silence. A joke murmured into the mat beside a trusted friend. A fragment of a song once heard in the agora. A question posed not for answer, but for the comfort of sound. These whispers, though forbidden, were rarely punished unless they disturbed the whole. In fact, the instructors often allowed them to pass, understanding that even the hardest shell needs a breath of air to avoid cracking. Such moments were rare, fleeting, and always loaded with risk, but they tethered the boys to their humanity, even if only for a heartbeat. Sometimes, older trainees would walk the rows during the night, not to inspect, but to observe. They had once lain on those same mats, stared at the same ceiling. Their eyes scanned the boys, not for faults, but for signs, for the twitch of a troubled sleeper, the stiffness of a boy too proud to rest. In these rare moments, compassion existed silently, without acknowledgement. A slightly adjusted cloak, a mat nudged straighter. These gestures were never discussed. To speak of kindness was to weaken it. But within the barracks, such invisible mercies stitched together a threadbare tapestry of endurance. For a few boys, night brought a peculiar kind of clarity. With the lights out and the noise gone, the lessons of the day settled in. They thought not of what had hurt, but of what they had overcome, the weight they had carried, the silence they had kept, the blow they had absorbed without flinching. These reflections were private victories, uncelebrated but deeply felt. No instructor would praise them in the morning, no comrade would know, but within the growing warrior, these small affirmations anchored the will to continue. As the night wore on, the stillness deepened. The barracks became a room of soft breaths, occasional turns, the creak of straw under a shifting body. Outside, the wind rustled through olive branches. Distant howls from the hills reminded the boys of the wildness that still ringed their city, a wildness they were being trained to confront, to tame, to embody. The contrast between the quiet of the room and the latent violence of the world beyond it was striking. In that contrast, the essence of Spartan life revealed itself. The calm was not natural, it was earned. And finally, just before the first gray light of dawn began to slip over the horizon, a collective breath seemed to draw in. The boys, whether they had slept soundly or not at all, began to stir in unison. No alarm, no command. The body had learned what the clock did not need to tell. A new day was beginning, and with it, a new cycle of tests, trials, and transformation. Nightfall in the barracks had ended, and though nothing had been spoken, every boy knew the silence had done its work. They had survived another night, and that alone was enough. In the silent hours between exhaustion and sleep, Spartan boys often found themselves visited by visions not of warmth or comfort, but of glory. Though the agoge crushed softness and stripped away sentiment, it could not fully erase the one desire that flickered in nearly every boy's chest: the hunger to prove himself. These were not idle daydreams, but disciplined fantasies, shaped by years of exposure to Spartan ideals. In their minds, the boys saw themselves holding the line in the phalanx, their shields braced, their spears steady. They imagined standing on fields soaked in the morning mist, shoulder to shoulder with comrades who would never falter. The path to such glory, however, was not shrouded in mystery. From the first day of the agoge, its milestones had been laid out with brutal clarity. At 7, the boy was taken from his mother. At 12, he learned to survive with almost nothing. By 15, he was expected to display initiative, leadership, and cruelty in equal measure. And by 20, he either emerged ready to join the ranks of Sparta's citizen warriors, or vanished from the path entirely, discarded as one unworthy. These were not dreams built on hope. They were built on structure, repetition, and endless trial. Glory was not an escape from discipline. It was its highest reward. Stories of past heroes were told sparingly, but when they left a deep imprint. Tales of Leonidas and the 300 at Thermopylae, of nameless hoplites who died rather than retreat, of young men who stood unmoving even as arrows darkened the sky. These stories were not told to entertain. They were tools hammered into the boys' memories to set the standard for what was possible. A boy might recall a line of poetry or a lesson from an instructor, but the image of a warrior bleeding out on his shield, smiling at death, would stay with him far longer. Among the boys, these dreams manifested in competition, not in spoken boasts. They had learned better than that, but in the fire that lit their eyes during drills, in the speed with which they volunteered for the most grueling tasks. They watched each other constantly, not only to assess strength, but to measure potential. Who would be the one to rise? Who would endure the cryptia and return to speak only with his eyes? Glory, in the Spartan sense, was never about standing apart from others. It was about becoming so reliable, so indispensable, that your presence elevated the entire line. These aspirations were fueled by ceremony as well. Though sparse, certain rites, like the presentation of arms to those who completed the agoge, or the rare but revered moment when a youth was publicly praised by an elder, left indelible marks, to be acknowledged, even once, by a veteran who had bled in battle, was to be given a glimpse of what lay ahead. The boys coveted such moments, even as they pretended indifference. Each one dreamed of one day being the figure others would admire silently, their name murmured in respect during whispered barrack conversations, long after the lamps were extinguished. Dreams of glory also mingled with fear. Glory required death to be always near. The boys knew this, and they did not romanticize it. They had seen peers collapse during training, had heard the stories of youths who never returned from the cryptia. They understood that the line between greatness and oblivion was razor thin. But in Sparta, Fear did not negate ambition, it refined it. The true dream was not to live forever. It was to live rightly, to die correctly, to be remembered for having upheld the code without hesitation. A short life lived in honor was worth more than decades wasted in hesitation. Even in youth, some boys imagined their place in the sacred phalanx. They envisioned the cool weight of bronze on their shoulders, the familiar press of their shield against a brother's side. They knew how to brace their feet in the dirt, how to breathe in rhythm with the man beside them. These were not fantasies born of inexperience, they were rehearsals. Every lesson, every beat of the agoge prepared them not only to perform, but to belong. To fail in formation was not just personal failure, was a betrayal of every man who had placed his life in your hands. For many, the dream extended beyond the battlefield. Some longed to become instructors, to one day pace the rows of boys and impart what they had endured. Others imagined themselves elected as ephors, guiding Sparta with the same cold clarity that had shaped them. A few dreamed of commanding armies, not for glory alone, but to ensure that the Spartan name continued to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. These ambitions were never spoken aloud, but they clung to the soul, silently directing every action, every sacrifice. To want was not un-Spartan so long as what you wanted was for Sparta. Still, not all dreams survived the rigors of the agoge. Some boys, broken by punishment, began to lower their gaze, to move with less conviction. Their dreams faded, replaced by the raw goal of survival. And even that was not always enough. Others clung to hope, using it like a handhold in the climb toward manhood. These boys bore the deepest scars, but also the clearest eyes. They understood that glory was not always glorious, that it sometimes meant dying in mud, unseen, unnamed, but knowing that the line held because you held your place. And so, beneath the silence of the barracks and the sting of discipline, the dreams of glory lived on, not as fantasies, but as compasses. They pointed the boys forward through the darkest nights, and when sleep finally took them, if it came at all, it carried not visions of comfort or ease, but of the day they would stand among the warriors, unshaken, unyielding, with the weight of Sparta behind them and the eyes of their younger selves watching from the shadows. In the quiet, rigid world of the Spartan barracks, where boys were forged into warriors through pain, silence, and relentless order, there existed a parallel force shaping them from the outside, one not clad in bronze or bearing a spear, but wrapped in woven wool, walking with heads high and voices firm. The women of Sparta, though absent from the agoge, were never far from its influence. They did not instruct with whips or drills, but their presence echoed through the halls of discipline all the same. In many ways, the unyielding backbone of Sparta's warrior machine was not the boy in training, but the mother who sent him there. Spartan women were unlike their counterparts in other Greek city-states, where Athenian women lived in seclusion, their voices hushed and their roles domestic. Spartan women were outspoken, physically strong, and politically astute. They were educated not only in letters and music, but in philosophy, estate management, and the ideals of virtue and pride. Girls trained in athletics from a young age, running, wrestling, throwing the javelin. Their bodies were shaped not for beauty, but for vigor, for the birth of strong sons who would one day defend the city. This belief that strong women bore stronger warriors was not poetic, it was doctrine. The influence of Spartan women on the boys in the agoge began at birth. Mothers were the first to whisper stories of honor, to praise courage and ridicule cowardice. They sang lullabies, not of love, but of glory. "With your shield, or on it," a mother would say as she handed her son to the state. These were not hollow words. They were an oath disguised as farewell, a commandment that would resound in the boy's mind through every test, every blow, every sleepless night. A Spartan mother was not a figure of comfort. She was a specter of expectation. Women in Sparta owned land, oversaw estates, and wielded economic power. With the men away on campaign or embedded in the barracks until age 30, it was the women who kept Sparta's domestic engine running. They were stewards of continuity, guardians of property, and enforcers of social reputation. A boy who faltered in training not only risked his place among his peers, he risked the shame of returning to a home where his mother's silence spoke volumes. For the Spartan boy, failure was not just institutional, it was deeply personal. His strength reflected her strength, his discipline her legacy. Among the ranks of the boys, stories circulated about famed women mothers who refused to mourn fallen sons, sisters who mocked brothers for returning unscarred, widows who stood proudly in public ceremonies, heads unbowed. These tales were told not with scorn, but with awe. They provided a model of a different kind of Spartan courage, one expressed not through battle, but through the refusal to yield to grief. The boys knew that the city was not merely built on their suffering, but also on the relentless will of the women who bore and raised them. Even the rituals of the agoge bore traces of female influence. During certain religious festivals, Spartan girls performed dances and sang choruses, praising bravery and mocking cowardice. These songs were not mere entertainment. They were tools of cultural enforcement. Boys who heard themselves praised in these verses stood taller the next day. Those ridiculed in song bore the sting longer than any lash. The voices of Spartan women shaped reputations as surely as spears shaped the phalanx. Honor and shame were wielded with equal precision from the lips of daughters and sisters. Romantic attachments were also affected by this dynamic. Marriage in Sparta was a solemn affair, often delayed until a man completed his military training. Even then, the union was shrouded in ritual and secrecy, sometimes beginning with symbolic abductions and hidden meetings. But the wife was never a subordinate in the household. She was expected to match her husband in resolve, to be his mirror in strength and restraint. Young men, even while still in the agoge, sometimes whispered to each other about future wives, not with lust, but with reverence. To marry a strong woman was to complete one's place in the Spartan order. For the boys in training, the memory of their mothers and the imagined judgment of the women they would one day marry was a constant, silent companion. It was not uncommon for a boy, upon enduring a difficult trial, to murmur to himself not the name of a god, but of a mother or sister watching from afar. These names anchored them. They reminded the boys that their endurance was not solely for themselves or their unit, but for the pride of the households that had borne them and the city that demanded their transformation. The legacy of Spartan women was not embroidered in cloth, but etched into the muscle and marrow of their sons. This dual system, forged in the barracks, women steeled in the home, created a uniquely balanced tension in Spartan society. Each role reinforced the other. The boys did not grow in isolation. They grew within a framework constructed by women who demanded excellence and endured loneliness, who sacrificed sons, not with weeping, but with steel in their gaze. The agoge's effectiveness did not begin at age 7. It began in the arms of mothers who knew that love meant letting go, that pride sometimes meant never saying goodbye at all. Thus, the Spartan woman, so often overlooked in the shadow of her warrior sons, was in truth a pillar of the entire state. She was not a soldier, but she bred them. She did not march, but she moved mountains with her silence. She did not fight, but her strength echoed in every Spartan shield lifted in defense of home. And the boys, as they grew into men, knew this. They carried her expectations like armor, felt her presence in every command barked by an instructor, in every lash endured, in every victory won. She was not behind them. She was within them, silent, steady, and unshakable. The moment a Spartan boy turned 20 marked the threshold between training and citizenship, between obedience and command, between silence and the right to speak. It was not celebrated with feasts or gifts, but with solemn expectation. From this point forward, he would be judged, not as a trainee, but as a Spartan, manhomoios, an equal among equals. The transition was not guaranteed, nor was it easy. Many boys reached the age, but failed to meet the unspoken requirements. For those who succeeded, however, the transformation was profound. The culmination of 13 years of discipline, endurance, and silent ambition. The final evaluations were unannounced. There were no graduation ceremonies. Instead, instructors and elders watched carefully in the final year, scrutinizing how a boy moved, how he led others, how he recovered from failure. They observed not only strength, but restraint. Could he command without cruelty? Could he submit without resentment? Could he be trusted with the weight of Sparta's legacy? These judgments were subtle but merciless. A single lapse in character and outburst, a selfish act, a moment of visible fear could seal a boy's fate. Those found unworthy were quietly removed, denied full citizenship, and assigned lesser roles within the state. For those who passed, the rewards were immense, though not in material wealth. The most significant was inclusion in a Caesarea dining group of full Spartan citizens. This was more than camaraderie. It was a declaration of trust. From this point on, the young man would eat, train, and fight beside the very men who had once served as examples. The dining table became the new battlefield, where loyalty was reaffirmed nightly, where bonds of unity were solidified. To speak out of turn, to bring shame to one's tablemates, was to risk exile. The discipline learned in the barracks was now enforced by peers, not instructors. Military service also began in earnest, though the boys had drilled with wooden spears and blunted swords for years. Now they were issued real weapons, cold bronze, sharpened edges, the weight of lethality. They joined standing units and were expected to march without hesitation, to sleep in the open, to live on sparse rations, and to bleed without protest. They were not yet veterans, but they were warriors. The phalanx welcomed them not as apprentices, but as brothers. The line was their home now, the shield their truest possession. They no longer trained for war, they were war. Despite this new status, humility was enforced. Young warriors were expected to defer to older men, to remain silent in council unless directly addressed, to observe and absorb the deeper rhythms of Spartan life. They were granted a voice, but only in measure. Their first campaigns were not opportunities for glory-seeking, but for proving reliability. A rash move in battle was condemned. A steady spear and a held position earned quiet praise. In this way, the young men learned that true strength in Sparta was measured not in impulse, but in composure, to act without emotion, to kill without hesitation, to follow orders without question. These were the marks of maturity. Some were chosen for special roles. The most disciplined and intelligent were selected to serve in the hippais, an elite unit of 300 chosen to guard the king and lead in battle. Others were appointed to oversee new recruits, becoming the very instructors they had once feared and emulated. These positions were not assigned by popularity, but by careful assessment. A man's past punishments, his history of discipline, his performance in both training and battle were considered. Reputation was everything, and so, even after the agoge, the shaping of the warrior continued. There was no endpoint, only progression. Outside of military life, the newly minted Spartans began to take on civic responsibilities. They voted in the assembly, debated laws, and participated in the complex machinery of Spartan governance. Unlike other Greek city-states, Sparta placed significant weight on the collective voice of its citizens, but only those who had earned the title through the crucible of the agoge. These young men learned that politics in Sparta was not a game of rhetoric, but of principle. To speak in public was to speak for Sparta, and so they chose their words carefully, as they had been taught to do in childhood. Marriage often followed soon after full citizenship. Though Spartans could marry before 20, it was only after graduation from the agoge that one truly entered adult family life. The young warrior might be assigned a wife through arrangement or choose one himself. But either way, the bond was not about romance, it was about duty. The goal was to produce strong offspring, to continue the line of disciplined citizens. Husbands and wives saw little of each other in early years, especially if the man was often on campaign. Yet the connection, rooted in mutual respect and shared values, was considered sacred. Reflection, too, became part of the warrior's inner life, though never discussed openly. Many young men looked back on their years in the agoge with a mixture of pride, resentment, and wonder. The pain, the hunger, the silence, they had endured it all. And now, as they marched under Spartan banners or sat in the assembly with other equals, they carried those memories not as burdens, but as tools. The boy they once were had not been erased, but forged into something harder, sharper. They did not speak of it, but they remembered. And in remembering, they understood who they had become. Thus, the transition from boy to warrior was not marked by a single act, but by an accumulation of choices, trials, and transformations. It was not something given, but something taken, earned through discipline, sealed in silence, and confirmed in the eyes of one's comrades. The Spartan man was not created at birth, nor even at 20. He was carved, slowly, painfully, by the city that demanded everything. And when he finally stood, equal in rank and ready for battle, he carried not just a spear and shield, but the entire weight of Sparta, sharpened and silent within his soul. The agoge left no monuments behind, no towering statues, no sprawling libraries, no ornate temples, and yet its legacy endured longer than many empires. Long after the last shield wall had fallen silent, and the bones of Spartans had merged with the dust of Laconia, the reputation of their training system echoed across centuries. For Sparta was not remembered for art or oration or empire. It was remembered for what it made of its sons. In the minds of enemies and allies alike, the Spartan warrior was not merely a soldier, but a symbol of endurance, of obedience, of unity, so absolute it defied reason. The influence of Spartan training extended beyond the borders of the Peloponnesus. Greek historians, like Herodotus and Xenophon, wrote of the agoge with a mixture of fear and admiration. Even their critics acknowledged that no other city produced such a coherent and disciplined fighting force. In the later Roman era, philosophers and generals referenced Spartan methods when discussing ideal forms of civic duty and martial preparation. The image of the Spartan boy, barefoot, silent, unyielding, became shorthand for the virtues of restraint and national service. Sparta had carved its identity so deeply into its people that even its collapse could not erase it. The memory of the agoge was preserved not just in written texts, but in the very way future military institutions structured themselves. Echoes of Spartan training can be found in the rigorous boot camps of modern armies. The uniformity, the erasure of individuality, the emphasis on brotherhood forged through shared suffering. Instructors stripping recruits of comfort, then rebuilding them as units. This, too, was a Spartan inheritance. While no other system replicated the agoge in its entirety, many borrowed its logic that the strongest army is not composed of the strongest individuals, but of those who can act as one. But Sparta's legacy was not without shadow. The same system that produced unbreakable warriors also crushed many beneath its weight. The agoge demanded absolute conformity. Those who could not endure were cast aside, their names forgotten. Empathy was not cultivated. Artistry, creativity, and introspection were sacrificed in favor of simplicity and strength. The Helots enslaved people who made the Spartan economy possible lived under constant fear, monitored by graduates of the Cryptia. For every boy who rose to glory, others were silenced, hidden, broken. The city-state that created heroes also enforced brutality, and its legacy is complicated by the price of its perfection. Even within Sparta, reflections on the agoge were not always uniformly celebratory. Some elders questioned whether the system had grown too rigid, whether the suppression of individuality was weakening the city's ability to adapt to new challenges. As foreign influences increased and warfare evolved, the limitations of the agoge's singular focus became more apparent. Sparta's military dominance began to wane, and with it, the assumption that its way of life was untouchable. The decline was slow but steady, and though the training remained, the confidence that it alone could secure the future began to falter. Still, among those who had passed through it, the agoge remained a source of identity until death. Veterans often returned to the barracks to instruct the next generation, their bodies bearing the marks of a lifetime spent in service. They moved with the same deliberate gait, spoke with the same measured tone. They did not reminisce, they reinforced. The agoge was not a memory but a mission passed down like a weapon from hand to hand. Its codes lived in gestures, in discipline, in silence. In many ways, the system endured, not because it was written in law, but because it was etched into muscle and memory. For modern historians and observers, the agoge continues to provoke fascination. How could a society maintain such a demanding system for so long? What psychological effects did it produce? Could such discipline exist today without devolving into cruelty? These questions are not easily answered, for the agoge was more than a training program. It was a culture, a religion of resilience. It asked not what a boy wanted, but what the city needed, and in doing so, it created a kind of strength that bordered on myth. The very brutality of the system is what made its survivors legends. In fiction and film, Sparta is often reduced to its most dramatic elements: the shout of warriors, the gleam of helmets, the final stand at Thermopylae. But beneath these images lies the deeper story. a generation-spanning experiment in molding human character through control, pain, and shared identity. The agoge was not about momentary courage, it was about conditioning courage until it became second nature. It didn't teach boys to fight, it taught them to stand unflinching in the face of death, knowing that retreat was not merely failure, but betrayal. Even in ruins, the agoge casts a long shadow. Tourists walk among stones that once echoed with the footsteps of boys bound for war. Scholars pore over fragments of law codes and philosophical commentary, searching for insight into this most severe of social orders. Parents still invoke Sparta when speaking of discipline. Athletes still reference Spartan training as the gold standard of grit. Though the city has long since faded, its name remains shorthand for endurance, self-denial, and unshakable focus. In the end, the legacy of Spartan training lies not in what it built, but in what it proved, that a society could choose discipline over comfort, unity over individuality, and sacrifice over ease, and that such a society, for all its flaws, could leave a mark that no army could erase. The agoge did not merely raise warriors, it raised symbols, and those symbols, centuries later, still march across the pages of history silent, steady, and forever unbroken.